The enemy arrives. The vast darkness of space seemed calm, but far beyond the stars, a danger was approaching. The Zalgar, an alien race known for conquering planet after planet, were heading toward Earth. They had wiped out many civilizations, leaving behind only ruins and ashes. The galaxy knew them as ruthless invaders who destroyed everything in their path. Now they had set their eyes on humanity. In the main control room of Earth's defense headquarters, Commander Jax stood staring at the large display. The screen showed the Zalgar fleet moving closer. It was massive, filled with warships and battle carriers that stretched across the void of space like an unstoppable wave. The Earth had seen nothing like this before. "How long until they reach us?" Jax asked, his voice steady but his eyes serious. 3 days, sir," replied one of the officers, looking up from his terminal. His hands were shaking slightly, but he kept his face straight. He knew the gravity of the situation. Everyone did. Commander Jax nodded and turned to his second-in-command, Captain Hale. "Start the full evacuation of the outer cities. Prepare the defensive lines. Make sure every soldier knows what's coming." Captain Hale saluted and hurried off. He was young but brave, and his confidence helped ease the tension in the room. The rest of the officers began working faster. Alarms started blaring across the planet, and all military forces were called to their stations. Across Earth, the news spread quickly. People stopped in their tracks as they watched the broadcasts. Families sat together, listening as the leaders of Earth spoke with grim determination. "We have faced threats before," said the president, her voice echoing through every device, every home. "But never like this. The Zalgar are coming. They have destroyed worlds. They show no mercy. But we are humans. We do not give up. We fight for our families, for our homes, for our very survival, and we will show them what it means to face humanity." The message was clear. Humanity would not run. They would stand and fight. In a small military base just outside New York City, Private Kira Davis tightened her boots. Around her, soldiers prepared for what could be the biggest battle of their lives. Some were cleaning their weapons, others checking armor and supplies. The air was heavy with tension, but also something else: determination. Kira's friend, Corporal Matt Reyes, sat beside her, looking over a map of the city. "Do you think we have a chance?" he asked, his voice low but not afraid. Kira looked up and gave him a firm nod. "We have more than a chance. We're not going down without a fight." Matt smiled slightly. "Ura?" he asked, raising his fist. Kira bumped her fist against his. "Ura?" she said with a grin. Around them, other soldiers were doing the same, quietly exchanging words of encouragement, steeling themselves for the battle ahead. Every soldier knew that the Zalgar were more advanced. Their weapons were stronger, their ships faster, and their numbers overwhelming. But the human spirit, the will to survive, was something no enemy could destroy. In space, Earth's fleet gathered. Hundreds of ships, from massive battleships to smaller, nimble fighters, moved into position. Admiral Harper, the leader of the space fleet, sat in his command chair on the flagship Ironclad. The ships were dwarfed by the size of the incoming Zalgar fleet, but every human pilot was ready. "Send out the signal to all ships," Harper ordered. His crew nodded, relaying his commands. On every ship, pilots and gunners received the message. It was short and simple: hold the line. Defend Earth at all costs. One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Chen, sat in his fighter jet, eyes focused on the void ahead. This was his first major battle, but he wasn't afraid. Like the rest of the fleet, he was ready to give his life to protect Earth. Beside him, other fighters hovered in formation, engines humming. They all knew what was at stake. Back on Earth, defenses were being set up in every city. Military bases buzzed with activity, and people prepared for what was to come. Tanks rolled into position, artillery was loaded, and soldiers took their places on the front lines. Even ordinary citizens were getting ready. Some had joined the fight, others were helping in any way they could. Commander Jax stood on the main command deck, watching everything unfold. He had fought in many battles, but this one felt different. The Zalgar were unlike any enemy humanity had faced before. They didn't just conquer, they destroyed. Jax knew that this fight would determine the future of the human race. He turned to Captain Hale. "How are the people holding up?" Hale checked the reports. "Morale is high, sir. They're scared, but they're ready. No one is running." Jax nodded. That was good. Fear was normal, but courage. That was what made humans dangerous to their enemies. "We have one chance to stop them," Jax said quietly, almost to himself. "And we're going to give it everything we've got." Outside the windows of the command room, the stars shone brightly. But somewhere out there in the distance, the Zalgar fleet was drawing closer. They were only days away now, and when they arrived, the fate of Earth would be decided. But humanity was ready. They would hold the line. They would fight for every inch of their world. And when the time came, they would show the Zalgar the meaning of Ura, preparing for battle. The Zalgar fleet was closing in fast. Earth had just days left to prepare for the greatest battle in human history. Everyone knew the stakes. This fight was for their survival. No one could afford to sit back. Every soldier, every pilot, every citizen had a part to play. In military bases across the globe, preparations moved at lightning speed. Equipment was checked and rechecked, soldiers were briefed, and all forces were mobilized. There was no time to waste. The invasion could begin at any moment. At Fort Liberty, one of the largest military bases in North America, Commander Jax arrived to oversee the preparations. The base was buzzing with activity. Tanks rumbled across the yard, jets screamed overhead, and soldiers hurried to their stations. Jax walked quickly through the base, his face set in a grim expression. There was no room for doubt now. Captain Hale walked beside him, a clipboard in hand, listing the preparations. "We've got the entire base on high alert. Ground forces are positioned, artillery is ready, and all air units are fully equipped. The outer cities are being evacuated as we speak." Jax nodded. "Good. We're going to need every soldier we have. The Zalgar won't hold back." They reached the command center, where several screens displayed live feeds of the global preparations. Jax watched as troops around the world dug in, setting up defensive lines and preparing for the fight of their lives. The atmosphere was tense, but there was no panic. Humans had faced long odds before and survived. "How are the troops holding up?" Jax asked, glancing at Captain Hale. Hale checked his notes. "Morale is high, sir. They know what's coming, but they're ready to fight." Jax smiled faintly. "Good. That's what we need, soldiers who won't break no matter what." In one corner of the base, Private Kira Davis stood with her squad, checking her rifle for what felt like the 100th time. Around her, the rest of the soldiers were doing the same, preparing, checking their gear, and getting mentally ready for the coming battle. The tension was thick, but Kira stayed focused. She had trained for this moment. "Looks like we're in for a hell of a fight," said Corporal Matt Reyes, standing beside her as he tightened the straps on his armor. His voice was calm, but his eyes showed the seriousness of the situation. Kira nodded, her face set in determination. "Yeah, but we'll hold the line. We always do." Matt grinned slightly. "Ura?" Kira smirked and bumped her fist against his. "Ura." The squad exchanged quiet nods and words of encouragement. Every soldier knew what was coming, but none of them wavered. They were prepared to give everything for Earth. At the same time, in space, Earth's fleet was preparing for the battle in orbit. Hundreds of ships, from small fighters to massive battle cruisers, were in position. Inside the command center of the flagship Ironclad, Admiral Harper stood in front of the main screen, watching the tactical displays closely. "All ships are reporting in, Admiral," said one of the officers. "The fleet is ready for combat." Harper nodded. He had led many battles before, but this one would be different. The Zalgar were the most dangerous enemy humanity had ever faced, and they had never been defeated. But Harper knew his people. He knew what humans could do when their backs were against the wall. "Make sure every pilot knows what's at stake," Harper said firmly. "We're fighting for Earth, for everything we hold dear. There's no retreat, no surrender. We fight until the end." The officer nodded and relayed the message across the fleet. On every ship, the mood was the same, serious, focused, and ready. The pilots strapped into their cockpits, preparing for launch. They knew this could be their final mission, but none of them hesitated. They were fighting for their home. Back on Earth, in cities and towns, people were also preparing in their own way. Evacuations had begun in areas closest to the expected attack zones. Families packed their belongings and headed toward safety. But even in the face of danger, there was no panic, just a quiet determination. In a small town outside Chicago, Sarah Miller helped her son pack a bag. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at his mother with wide eyes. "Are the aliens really coming, Mom?" Sarah paused, kneeling down to look her son in the eyes. "Yes, they are," she said softly, "but we're going to be safe." The soldiers are going to protect us. The boy nodded, his little hands gripping the straps of his backpack. He trusted his mother's words, but the fear in his eyes was hard to miss. Still, Sarah smiled and gave him a reassuring hug. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We'll be okay." At military bases all over the world, the same scene played out. Families said their goodbyes to soldiers heading off to the front lines. Fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, each one knowing they might not see each other again, but also knowing that they were fighting for a cause bigger than themselves. As the final hours ticked down, Commander Jack stood in front of a large group of soldiers. His face was calm, but his voice carried the weight of the situation. "We don't have much time left before the Zalgar arrive," he began, pacing in front of the assembled troops. "They're strong. They're dangerous. But so are we. We've trained for this. We've prepared for this, and when they come, we will show them what it means to face humanity." The soldiers stood tall, listening intently. Some were nervous, some were eager, but all of them were ready. "This is our home," Jax continued. "We fight for our families, for our friends, for the future of our planet. The Zalgar think they can take it from us, but they're wrong. We will hold the line. We will not back down. And when this battle is over, the galaxy will know what humans are capable of." "Ura!" shouted a soldier in the back, and soon the cry spread across the entire base. "Ura!" the soldiers yelled, their voices rising in unison. The sound echoed through the air, a powerful reminder of the strength and unity of the human race. Commander Jack smiled. The preparations were complete. Now all they had to do was wait for the enemy. First attack. The day had arrived. The Zalgar fleet, dark and massive, hovered on the edge of Earth's space. Their ships blocked out the stars, their weapons ready to strike. The countdown was over. The first attack was about to begin. In the command center of the flagship Ironclad, Admiral Harper watched the monitors. Every ship in Earth's fleet was in position, prepared for the worst. The human forces were outnumbered, but they were not afraid. They had trained for this. They had prepared for this. And now they would fight. "Enemy fleet in range," reported one of the officers. His voice was tense but steady. Admiral Harper leaned forward in his chair. "All ships prepare for engagement," he ordered. "This is it. We fight to defend our home." Across the fleet, pilots and gunners braced for battle. In small fighters, young pilots gripped their controls, eyes focused on the black void ahead. In the larger warships, crews hurried to their stations, ready to fire at the enemy. The air was thick with tension, but no one hesitated. Every single soldier knew what was at stake. On the ground, Commander Jack stood with his troops at Fort Liberty. The skies above were clear for now, but that would change soon. Jax knew the Zalgar wouldn't just attack from space. They would come for Earth's cities, its people, its soldiers. "Stay sharp, everyone," Jax said, his voice cutting through the hum of activity around him. "The Zalgar will be here any minute. When they come, we hit them hard." Private Kira Davis stood with her squad, her rifle in hand. She could feel the tension in the air, but she wasn't scared. She had trained for this moment, and she knew her squad had her back. Beside her, Corporal Matt Reyes was checking his gear, the same determined look on his face. "You ready for this?" Matt asked, glancing at Kira. She nodded. "More than ready. We're going to give them a fight they'll never forget." Matt smiled, but there was no time for more words. The warning sirens blared across the base, and everyone snapped into action. "The enemy is here!" someone shouted. Kira's heart raced as she looked up. In the distance, dark shapes began to appear in the sky. Alien ships, sleek and menacing, were descending toward Earth. The Zalgar had arrived. Human heroes. The battle against the Zalgar was far from over. The skies burned with fire as ships clashed above, and on the ground, soldiers fought desperately to hold the line. The Zalgar were relentless, their forces strong, but in the chaos of war, human heroes began to emerge. At the front lines, Private Kira Davis and her squad were pinned down behind a destroyed building. Alien fire rained down on their position, but they refused to retreat. Kira gripped her rifle, her heart pounding. Her squad had been in tough spots before, but this was different. They were surrounded, and it seemed like there was no way out. "We're running out of time here," Corporal Matt Reyes shouted, ducking behind cover as another explosion rocked the ground. Kira knew he was right. The Zalgar were closing in, their forces pressing harder. She glanced around, searching for a solution. Then she saw it, An enemy supply truck, filled with explosives, parked just a few hundred yards away. If they could blow it up, it might create a distraction, giving them a chance to escape. "I've got an idea!" Kira shouted, pointing to the truck. "If we can get close enough, we can take out that truck. It'll give us the cover we need." Matt looked at her, eyes wide. "That's suicide!" But Kira's mind was made up. She knew the risks, but there was no other choice. "I'll go. You guys cover me." Before anyone could argue, Kira sprinted from behind cover, running toward the truck. Bullets and energy blasts whizzed past her, but she didn't slow down. Every second felt like a lifetime, but she kept moving, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her squad laid down covering fire, doing their best to keep the Zalgar soldiers distracted. Kira reached the truck, her heart racing. She planted the explosives she had in her pack, quickly setting the timer. There was no time to waste. As soon as the explosives were in place, she turned and ran back toward her squad. Just as she made it back to cover, the truck exploded in a massive fireball, sending debris and Zalgar soldiers flying. The shockwave knocked Kira off her feet, but she was alive. The explosion had done its job. The Zalgar forces were in disarray, giving her squad the opening they needed. "That was insane!" Matt shouted, pulling Kira to her feet, his face a mix of shock and admiration. Kira grinned, breathing hard. Yeah, but it worked. Far from the front lines, in the depths of the city, a different kind of hero was at work. Sergeant Olivia Brooks, a seasoned engineer, was leading a team to repair a critical defense system that had gone offline. Without it, the city's shields were down, leaving it vulnerable to attack. Brooks and her team had been working for hours, racing against the clock as explosions rocked the city around them. The air was thick with dust and smoke. But they kept working, knowing that failure was not an option. "Sergeant, we're almost there," one of her engineers shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise of the battle. Brooks wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands moving quickly over the control panel. The wiring was damaged and fixing it wasn't easy. "Keep at it," she ordered. "We've got to get these shields back online." Just as she spoke, a group of Zalgar soldiers appeared at the far end of the street. They spotted Brooks and her team and started firing. Her team wasn't equipped for combat. They were engineers, not soldiers. "Take cover!" Brooks shouted, grabbing her pistol. She wasn't about to let her team get taken out before they finished their job. She returned fire, keeping the Zalgar at bay while her team worked. Every second counted. The shields needed to come back up or the city would fall. One of her engineers, a young woman named Leah, was working frantically on the final connection. "I've almost got it, Sergeant," she called out, her voice shaking. Brooks fired another shot, taking down an advancing Zalgar soldier. "Hurry!" she yelled back. Leah's hands flew over the controls, and then with a loud hum, the system came back online. The city's shields flickered to life, glowing faintly in the air above them. They were back in the fight. "We did it!" Leah shouted, grinning with relief. Brooks nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Nice work, everyone. Let's get out of here before the next wave hits." Not far from where Brooks and her team were working, a sniper named Lieutenant John Cole had taken position on top of a high-rise building. From his vantage point, he could see the entire battlefield. His job was simple: take out high-priority Zalgar targets and provide cover for the ground forces. Cole lay flat on his stomach, his rifle trained on a Zalgar officer directing the alien forces from a distance. He exhaled slowly, calming his breathing as he lined up the shot. The Zalgar officer moved into his crosshairs, and Cole squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the officer dropped instantly. Without their leader, the Zalgar forces hesitated, unsure of their next move. Cole didn't waste time. He quickly shifted his aim to another target, a group of Zalgar soldiers preparing to flank the human troops. One by one, the enemies fell. Cole's shots were precise, each one taking out a key target that could have turned the tide against the humans. His actions allowed the ground forces to regroup and push back against the Zalgar, keeping the line from breaking. As the battle raged on, stories of heroism spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had once been scared now fought with renewed determination. They saw Kira's daring run to blow up the enemy truck, Brooks and her team's desperate work to bring the shields back online, and Cole's pinpoint sniping that kept the enemy at bay. These moments inspired others to fight harder, to push through their fear and to stand their ground. The Zalgar had underestimated humanity. They thought their advanced technology and overwhelming numbers would crush Earth's defenses. But they hadn't counted on the courage and resourcefulness of the human spirit. Across the battlefield, from space to the ground, human heroes were rising up, proving that even in the darkest moments, humanity would fight back. They weren't just soldiers, they were survivors. They were defenders of Earth, and the Zalgar were learning that humans were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The time had come. The skies were dark with smoke and fire, and the ground shook from the weight of the battle. The Zalgar had launched their final assault, throwing everything they had at Earth's defenders. This was the moment that would decide the fate of humanity. In the command center of Fort Liberty, Commander Jax stood over the tactical map, his face grim. The Zalgar were pushing hard, and Earth's forces were stretched to their limits. The final battle had begun, and there was no turning back. "Sir, the Zalgar are breaking through on the Eastern Front," a young officer reported, his voice tense. Jax nodded, his mind racing. "Send reinforcements. We can't let them breach the city. Hold the line at all costs." The officer saluted and hurried off to relay the orders. Jax stared at the map, watching the icons representing human and Zalgar forces shift across the screen. This was it, the endgame. Either they stopped the Zalgar here or humanity would fall. On the front lines, Private Kira Davis and her squad were fighting with everything they had. The Zalgar were relentless, their soldiers pouring across the battlefield like a flood. Explosions filled the air, and the ground was littered with debris and the bodies of fallen comrades. "Keep firing!" Kira shouted, her voice hoarse from yelling. Her rifle was hot in her hands, and her body ached from the hours of fighting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The Zalgar were pushing hard, but Kira and her squad were determined to hold their ground. Beside her, Corporal Matt Reyes was firing with precision, his face grim. "We can't let them through!" he yelled, blasting an approaching Zalgar soldier. Kira nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the desperation in the faces of her fellow soldiers. They were running low on ammo, and the enemy was getting closer. But they had one thing the Zalgar didn't: hope. As long as they fought, as long as they held the line, there was still a chance. In space, above the planet, Earth's fleet was locked in a brutal battle with the Zalgar ships. The void of space was lit up by explosions as ships from both sides fired everything they had. Admiral Harper stood on the bridge of the ironclad, his face set in a hard expression as he watched the battle unfold. "Shields at 50%, Admiral," one of the officers reported, panic in his voice. Harper gripped the railing tightly. "Divert all power to the forward weapons. Target their flagship. We take that down and we might have a chance." The ironclad shifted course, its massive guns turning toward the Zalgar's command ship. Harper knew it was a long shot, but if they could destroy the enemy flagship, it might cripple the Zalgar forces and give Earth a fighting chance. The ship's cannons roared to life, sending a barrage of energy blasts toward the Zalgar flagship. Explosions rocked the enemy ship, but it wasn't enough. The Zalgar flagship returned fire, hitting the ironclad with a devastating blast. "Damage to the hull, Admiral," another officer shouted. Harper didn't flinch. "Keep firing! We don't stop until that ship is down." The battle raged on, but Harper refused to give up. This was their last stand. If they failed here, Earth was finished. Back on the ground, the situation was just as desperate. The Zalgar had unleashed their full might, and the human forces were struggling to hold them back. Tanks rolled across the battlefield, firing at the alien invaders, while soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the trenches. Kira's squad was pinned down, surrounded by Zalgar soldiers. They were running out of ammo, and the enemy was closing in. Kira's hands shook as she reloaded her rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. "We can't hold them much longer," Matt shouted, his voice filled with urgency. On the ground, the battle was nearing its end. The Zalgar, disorganized and demoralized after the destruction of their command post, were retreating. Kira and her squad stood among the wreckage, exhausted but alive. "We did it," Matt said, breathing hard as he looked at Kira with a grin. "We actually did it." Kira nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. The final battle was over. They had won. Against all odds, humanity had survived. But Kira knew that this victory had come at a great cost. Many had fallen, and the scars of this war would last for a long time. But for now, they had done what seemed impossible. They had defeated the Zalgar. Kira looked around, her mind racing. They needed a plan, something to turn the tide. And then she saw it. a Zalgar command post just a few hundred meters away. If they could destroy it, it might disrupt the enemy forces and give the humans a chance to regroup. "I've got an idea," Kira said, determination in her voice. "We're going to take out that command post." Matt looked at her like she was crazy. "Are you serious? We barely have any ammo left." Kira nodded, her eyes focused. "It's our only chance. We take it out, we might break their lines." Without waiting for an answer, Kira grabbed a handful of grenades and started moving toward the command post, staying low to avoid enemy fire. Matt and the rest of the squad followed, covering her as best they could. As they got closer, the Zalgar forces started to notice them. Gunfire erupted, and Kira could feel the bullets whizzing past her head. But she kept going, her heart pounding in her ears. This was it, their last shot. Kira reached the command post, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled the pin on the first grenade and threw it toward the center of the enemy encampment. It exploded with a deafening roar, sending Zalgar soldiers flying. Without hesitation, she threw the second grenade and then the third. The command post erupted in flames, and for a moment, the Zalgar forces faltered. Kira didn't waste any time. "Go, go, go!" she shouted to her squad, and they charged forward, taking advantage of the chaos. The human forces, seeing the explosion, rallied. With renewed energy, they pushed back against the Zalgar, driving them away from the city. The tide was turning. In space, Admiral Harper watched as the Zalgar flagship began to break apart under the relentless fire from the ironclad. The enemy ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light, and the Zalgar fleet began to fall into disarray. "We did it," Harper whispered, a small smile crossing his face. The battle was over. The last of the Zalgar ships were fleeing, their once mighty fleet shattered and broken. On the ground, the remaining alien soldiers were either captured or retreating into the wilderness. The humans had won the final battle, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as it should. Commander Jack stood in the command center of Fort Liberty, looking out over the battlefield. The smoke was starting to clear, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Buildings were in ruins, the earth scorched and torn apart by explosions. The city they had fought so hard to defend was in pieces, and thousands of soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. "We did it," Jack said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But at what cost?" Admiral Harper's voice crackled over the radio from space. "We've confirmed the Zalgar fleet is retreating, Commander. They've abandoned the planet. Earth is safe, for now." Jax nodded, though there was little joy in his heart. "Understood, Admiral. Good work up there. Likewise down there. We couldn't have done it without you." As the radio went silent, Jax took a deep breath. They had won, but the war had left scars that would take years to heal. And while the immediate threat was over, he knew the Zalgar could return one day. The real work had only just begun. In the streets of the ruined city, soldiers were gathering the wounded and helping civilians find shelter. Medical teams were working around the clock to treat the injured, and rescue crews were digging through the rubble, searching for survivors. Private Kira Davis sat on a piece of debris, staring out at the destruction. Her rifle rested across her lap, and her body ached from the long days of fighting. She had survived, but many of her friends hadn't. Beside her, Corporal Matt Reyes sat quietly, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He looked just as exhausted as she felt. "Ver," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kira nodded, though the relief she had expected to feel wasn't there. "Yeah, we won." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them trying to process everything that had happened. The battle had been brutal, and they had seen so many people fall, good people who had fought bravely for their home. The victory was real, but it was also bittersweet. "Do you think this will be enough?" Matt asked after a long pause. "Do you think the Zalgar will stay away now?" Kira shook her head. "I don't know, but I think we've shown them something they didn't expect. We showed them that we're stronger than they thought." Matt smiled slightly. "Yeah, deadly, deadly humans." Kira couldn't help but smile back. "That's right. We held the line." At the city's central plaza, a group of leaders and soldiers had gathered for a ceremony to honor those who had fallen. Commander Jack stood at the front, addressing the crowd. His voice was strong, but there was sorrow in his eyes. "Today we celebrate a great victory," Jack said, his voice echoing across the plaza. "But we also remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. They fought not just for themselves, but for all of us, for their families, for their homes, for the future of humanity. And we will never forget them." I can't believe it's finally